Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is business leader, facilitator, and author Anne Hilton. Hilton is the founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute, which is committed to the growth and development of Indigenous economies. She is the author of Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, a book about igniting the $100 billion Indigenous economy. Anne, awesome to have you with us. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And we're lucky to have you because you're in Winnipeg right now hosting the Indigenomics She Conference, the third one, the second here in Winnipeg. Can you tell us a bit about the conference?
Yeah, absolutely. So Indigenomics She is about building on the success narrative of Indigenous women in business, how we're excelling, how we're creating positive stories, and a future that looks a place of how we're included, what we're building, and really what success in Indigenous economy looks like from a woman's perspective.
And definitely want to talk about those successes, but we've mentioned the word Indigenomics a bunch of times already. Maybe if you could tell us, because I believe you coined this phrase, tell us what Indigenomics is.
Yeah, Indigenomics is a new word that essentially means economics from an Indigenous worldview. It's about our modern, constructive, generative design of how we're building our inclusion into the mainstream economy, but through an Indigenous worldview.
What are you hoping that Indigenous women are taking away from the conference here in Winnipeg?
I think what's being taken away is the positive space, a positive network, and positive stories about what our experience is and how we support each other and how we bring a voice to that experience of the places that we're excelling in business. Obviously,
the second one here, or the first one here in Winnipeg, was success that brought you back.
Yes, I really like having Indigenomics She here. I think that there's this historical context of Winnipeg from an Indigenous worldview and the original trade networks and connection both across the country and across the continent that it makes sense to keep Indigenomics She here in Winnipeg.
Tons of speakers, Indigenous women in business, speaking at this. Do you think that many are surprised by how many Indigenous women are leading the way in business and heading up organizations?
I'm not sure if it's surprise, it's just the ability to bring visibility to that and just uphold and uplift each other in a success narrative.
What are some of the exciting things that you're seeing Indigenous women do out there?
From this conference, I think we're seeing an increasing number of Indigenous women on corporate boards. We're seeing Indigenous women increasingly undertaking master level business degrees and just participating in new ways and creating, I think there's a number that's identified that Indigenous women are creating businesses at 5 times the rate, and I think that represents seeing business as a tool that makes sense for ourselves, for our families, and our communities.
Now, is that something you're also seeing right across Canada?
Yeah, there is a huge wave. There's a literal tidal wave of Indigenous people starting businesses and across many sectors, but also auxiliary to the nation's or communities' businesses, but also changing that story for families and for individuals of this is generational work that we're doing right now and how important that is around business as a tool for our success today.
We've had some guests on the show here, women entrepreneurs who started things in their own kitchens and now own big warehouses. Are you seeing more and more women getting into entrepreneurship?
Absolutely. I think we're seeing it across where a small dream becomes a possibility, and as the discussion around access to capital is changing, where more options are becoming available, the pathway to becoming an entrepreneur is also increasingly more available. And I also think in parallel to that is also as some of the more northern communities or rural communities have experienced the lack of access to connectivity. Connectivity is a game changer of increasing Indigenous entrepreneurs' ability to develop businesses.
When it comes to things like grants or startup funding, is there much out there available for Indigenous women entrepreneurs?
There is and there isn't. I think it's important to understand that within a larger context, the growth of the Indigenous economy can't exist solely within government programs, but we are seeing significant Indigenous-focused entrepreneurship, that Indigenous-led dollars essentially to support the growth of the rise of Indigenous entrepreneurial capital investment. And I think we're seeing that more and more of Indigenous-led capital.
Like you say, it can't be just government funding, I guess, but do you think the attitude at banks, financial institutions, has changed when it comes to backing the ideas of Indigenous women?
I absolutely think so. I think we're seeing at the top levels, if you look at the big 6 banks, including Bank of Canada, we're seeing Indigenous peoples as corporate directors on these banks, and that is a massive shift, where even we look at some of those include residential school survivors who within a generation are accessing and creating spaces and sitting at tables that were never meant for us as Indigenous people. I think that we're also hearing the financial sector realizing that this wave, what we talk about through Indigenomics, is what happens beyond $100 billion Indigenous economy, that in our process of achieving that right now, the financial sector is needing to respond in a way that advances economic reconciliation and advances outcomes that are measurable and accountable, and that products and programs are actually started from listening to Indigenous peoples and entrepreneurs, and that act of listening is the most important element of actually building a response to our experience.
What are some of the things, do you think, that could be done to assist Indigenous women in getting their ideas off the ground?
I think we're seeing a considerable increase of directories of Indigenous businesses regionally, provincially, and the more that we create visibility for Indigenous women in business, the more success. I think companies building practices of including Indigenous products within their value chains, Indigenous corporate gifting, all of those aspects. I think companies and visibility just overall of Indigenous women in business becomes really important, of creating a network and recommendations and that visibility in terms of directories.
Did you yourself experience any challenges coming up as you were, just because you're a woman, because you're Indigenous?
I feel like I was 14 when I was first exposed and had a mentor that was an Indigenous woman in business, and being able to see the success and the challenges at an early age, I actually found very inspiring. And to have an Indigenous woman as a mentor in business from that age, I think I feel very lucky that it allowed me a mindset beyond barriers and beyond challenges, that business made sense and business was a tool that I could actually utilize to advance my own life and advance a vision that I had around Indigenous peoples and the economy.
I guess that's maybe why these conferences that you hold are so important, to see what other people are doing, hear their struggles and their successes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's just this powerful strength-based narrative that demonstrates what's possible when Indigenous women start businesses, and the stories of overcoming accesses, the limitations to access to opportunity. I think that story is shifting considerably, and the more visibility that Indigenous women in business have, I think it creates stronger pathways to building economic reconciliation outcomes.
This third conference based is solely for women. Are the challenges that people have faced the same throughout all these conferences? Have they all dealt with similar challenges getting their businesses going?
I think that there's one part of the development of the business, but I think it's equally important to look at the development of the person and how you're showing up and the courage that it takes to be an Indigenous entrepreneur. And I think it's the balance of those two aspects, that there's the challenges in developing a business, but also the challenge of being able to stand in your truth of what's possible and what is being built, and to have the supports and the visibility around other women are doing this and other women are creating these solid foundations of successful business foundations.
Carol Ann, more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Indigenomics founder and CEO, Carol Anne Hilton. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Carol Anne Hilton, the founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute. Carol Anne, before the break, we were talking about the SHE event underway now in Winnipeg, but not the only event the Indigenomics Institute puts on. You also do events in Saskatoon, Toronto, Vancouver, including the one that's coming up right away in Toronto, Indigenomics on Bay Street. Can you talk about that conference?
Yeah, absolutely. We created Indigenomics Bay to be able to bring to the financial sector, the heart of this country, that to be able to bring a demonstration of and visibility of what Indigenous economic power looks like, and in the rise of the Indigenous economy, in the achievement of a $100 billion Indigenous economic target, that it's essential to be able to see Indigenous peoples and businesses as an opportunity, and that in centering Indigenous economic power within the financial sector and within corporate Canada, to be able to understand what leadership in that looks like, and to be able to bring stories of the actual demonstration of Indigenous economic power.
Now, you talked about being beyond $100 billion. Can you tell us more about the $100 billion Indigenous economy, where that number comes from?
So originally, the concept was based around that if Indigenous people make up 5% of the economy, of the population, that 5% of the economy would be about $100 billion. That was back in 2019, and now we're looking at the achievement of that. I am recently releasing a Indigenomics National $100 billion Indigenous economic study. It will be the first of its kind. That will be an inaugural study as a benchmark, but it will also be the first AI-generated Indigenous economic activity study. And I think that the demonstration of beyond $100 billion is right in front of us, and to be able to look at a stream of Indigenous projects that are well over the $1 billion level, to understand the ownership and the investment and the environment that is shaping value creation. That's what we've set out to be able to do, both within this study and within the $100 billion economic target.
What makes up the $100 billion, or where are we at currently with the business and getting to that number?
So I look at it from an Indigenomics perspective that GDP has not served Indigenous people well. We've always been behind the starting point. We've never had the appropriate data that values the visibility of who we are as people. So the data in particular around GDP doesn't actually, it's like a peg in a square, in a round hole, that the ability to measure Indigenous economic power versus GDP as a contribution to the larger community. I think that when we look at instead and ask the question, how is value creation happening in the Indigenous economy, we can see that across land settlements, large cash transfers that are occurring with that. We can see that within major legal cases that are won where Indigenous jurisdiction is being transferred. We can see that in new trends in terms of investment, particularly within major project development, where Indigenous businesses are at increasingly numbers becoming equity owners in major assets, airlines, transportation, rails, pipelines, you name it. And I think the development of this thread of billion-dollar levels of Indigenous partnerships is becoming self-evident in the achievement of the $100 billion.
When you're out there and speaking with people and the numbers that you see in these reports, what would be some of the industries where, Indigenous peoples are most active?
I think it's always naturally been natural resources, of course, in terms of land-based resource economies. I think that we're seeing it, communications, technology, definitely as emerging sectors where Indigenous peoples are increasingly becoming participants within.
Key to lots of this would be procurement policies, and want to get to that, but we've been hearing a lot about Ottawa's Indigenous procurement policy and how that was being abused, that maybe there weren't actual Indigenous peoples other than on a piece of paper at these companies. Any thoughts on how that policy and the things that we're reading coming out of stellar reporting by our former colleague Melissa Ridgen and her colleagues at Global News, but your thoughts on what we're hearing coming out of what that was meant to do and what it has maybe actually been doing?
I think it's a self-created problem by Ottawa in terms of their definition through the Indian Act, through the definition and denial of Indigenous identity over time from the beginning of this country. Ottawa created the problem, and we're really going to need to hear from Ottawa in terms of the solutions for it. I don't think it's time for sit back and look at Indigenous organizations or nations and peoples. We can refer to the problems, but I think the solutions are going to have to be driven for Ottawa to take a hard look at itself and address this in a way that takes responsibility of why this is a problem.
Many levels of government, cities, provinces are putting in place an Indigenous procurement policy. What needs to be done, do you think, to ensure that the Indigenous peoples are the ones actually benefiting from those policies?
I think we're actively seeing Indigenous peoples being engaged in the definition. I think we're seeing targets that need to be accountable and publicly available. We see cities like Saskatoon, regions like Yukon. Yukon, I think, has a 20% Indigenous procurement regional or territorial target. But it's when we see the accountability and the public nature of that is when we'll be able to define that success.
What do you think can be done to help highlight Indigenous people's business and success stories?
I think this framework of beyond 100 billion, that this is an opportunity and a call to action that the companies that actually understand Indigenous people not as a risk but as an opportunity, not just in the financial sector. At Indigenomics, we're able to create really positive partnerships. Some of our original ones included TELUS, Vancity, out on the West Coast, Microsoft, MasterCard, Interac, really where these companies are coming forward and saying, how do we demonstrate the story of what our pathway of economic reconciliation is, and just as much as that corporate engagement, the development of corporate economic reconciliation action plans, again, that are public, accountable, and able to be communicated what the results are in actual economic value. I think that is going to be a major success factor in the next Indigenous economy beyond 100 billion.
For a couple of years now, you've been doing the Indigenomics Top 10. I guess, can you give us, I don't know if you want to give us any clues ahead of the Toronto one, but why have these companies in the past been ones that you wanted to highlight as a top 10?
Yeah, the Indigenomics annual 10 to watch list has demonstrated positive partnerships, positive business structures, business outcomes, whether it's government policy or programs, whatever that is. And even looking at this foundation of, I think this is going into our 7th one now, of a narrative that describes the principles of designing economic outcomes in the Indigenous economy, the stories of what mattered in that, how outcomes were created and why that's important, and to start building this common narrative of that and bring visibility to success. That's what we set out to do within that. And each year to look at the innovation, the architecture of, we need to build something that addresses innovation and solution. I think that's what these 10 to watch are able to do. And just watching this increasing demonstration of, again, this success-based narrative of what are partnerships, investment, and structures that advance Indigenous economic growth.
When we talked about, the industries, I guess, that Indigenous peoples are most involved in, and like you say, natural resources, whether it be oil and gas or forestry or mining, is it it seems like capitalism and, some of the traditional values, protecting Mother Earth, just are kind of at odds with each other. How do you, I guess, square those two different things?
I think that the inheritance of stewardship from an Indigenous worldview has been denied to us just as much as the seat at the economic table of this country. In the denial of our ability to activate stewardship and responsibility and decision-making for future generations, that is what is being created through our own jurisdictions, through nation building, through self-determination, through self-governance, is our ability to include the decision-making frameworks that return to our ability to manage risk. And I think as we look at complex sectors, the ability for us to sit at the tables that around decisions that are looking at the stewardship and risk management, that's where that balance will come in, is that our ability to be included in these decisions, in policy, in regulations, that's where that balance will come in, is we're able to return to decision-making spaces.
Carol Anne, more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is the founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute and the author of Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Table, Carol Anne Hilton. Carol Anne, you studied your Master's of Business Administration overseas, and you've been at this for quite some time now. Just wondering, what was it that first got you so interested in, business and economics?
At the time that I did my degree, there was a lot of Indigenous students going into education, social work, law. There wasn't a lot of students going into business, and I wanted to be able to have a degree that was able to be applied, and it was less theoretical and more practical, and business was the most practical that I could find.
So you weren't doing lemonade stands at the age of 4 or anything like that? You always knew you wanted to be involved with business?
Business makes sense to me. I think there's the historical context of it, there's the modern context of it, and there's this space of resilience that makes sense of what we understand in terms of historical trade, how we understand business in a different worldview, and to be able to look at the state of what it is in the language of business today, I think agrees with where my inspirations lie.
We mentioned your book there, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Table. I understand you have a second book on the way?
Yes, it will be published on April 7th will be the release date, and the book is called The Rise of Indigenous Economic Power, Deconstructing Indian Act Economics.
Nice. Good title. What can you tell us about the book?
Absolutely. I believe it is time for this country to start talking about that there's two types of economy happening. There's economy as we know it, and there's Indian Act economics. The pull of Indian Act economics and its imbalance to the actual pace of business or to the actual pace of the rise of the Indigenous economy, it becomes really important to name it, it becomes really important to talk about it, and it becomes really important to become aware of it. And I think the more that we start naming this undertow of Indian Act economics, to look at the cause, to look at what's being inherited, and to look at it as the bias that exists within this country, that it is a prevention further to the rise of Indigenous economic power. The response of what we're looking at beyond $100 billion Indigenous economy, the fundamental foundation that has been deconstructed over time is our relationship and the limiting factors of that, and the continuation of that is also where we'll see continued success within our businesses.
What would be an example of Indian Act economics?
I think the fact that there still is reserve systems, there's still the essential requirements for decisions to go through the minister. I think the limiting factors of band council resolutions with a 5-year time frame, all of those aspects, and while there's more of course, but all of those aspects demonstrate the lack of alignment of the Indian Act to the actual rise of the Indigenous economy. And I think the other aspect that I talk about in the book is to describe that if the Indian Act was in alignment with UNDRIP, which is currently mandated to be undertaken, what that actually looks like and what that actually means in terms of economic empowerment and self-determination of Indigenous peoples and businesses.
We'll look forward to that in April. Just lastly, Carol Ann, somebody who's surrounded constantly with business leaders, success stories, things of that nature, and what you do. What is your advice to those out there looking to start their own business that have that entrepreneurial spirit?
I think it's important to start building an ecosystem of people around you, other business owners. I think it's equally important to be able to address courage, because it takes a lot of courage to become an Indigenous entrepreneur, and to have the response of your own personal development and the response to building a supportive ecosystem and mentors and just a visible success of others that have been able to do that.
Good stuff, Carol Ann. Well, really appreciate that you were able to come in and join us here in studio. Thanks for joining us this week on the show.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That is all the time we have for the show this week. You can always catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website or by visiting our APTN News page on YouTube. Of course, this show and past episodes are also available as podcasts, and you can find those wherever you download your podcasts. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in to Face to Face. We will see you back here in 7 days.